Senator Siewert.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. I present the report of the Community Affairs Reference Committee on former forced adoption policies and practices and move that the report be printed.
The question is that motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. Senator Siewert.
I move that the report take note of this report. Mr Deputy President, it is with great I say pleasure, but it's pleasure in terms of finally this issue is being addressed. The time I have to speak now will not do justice to the report and the evidence we have been given, so I urge members of the community to read this report. I'd like to start by quoting Ms Charlotte Smith, who we quote in our report. A mother whose child has been stolen does not only remember in her mind, she remembers with every fibre of her being. Mr Deputy President, I would like to acknowledge all the mothers and the fathers, the adoptees and family members who are in the galleries today and who have, some for the first time, shared their experiences of their forced adoption with the committee and with the community. I know how much it took for them to do that and what a toll it has taken. I'd also like to quote from a mother who wanted her name withheld. And she said, I'd lie in bed every night with my arms wrapped around my baby inside of me, knowing that I would never hold him after birth. I'd feel his feet and hands through my own stomach as he moved around, knowing that I wasn't ever going to feel them after he was born. I'd talk to him and tell him that I would find him again one day and that I and his father loved him and always would. I'd pray to God every night for him to send someone to get me out of there and to show me a way to keep my baby, but no one did. I'd think of running away, but where would I run? Who would I run to? That typifies so many of the stories that we heard of women thinking they had nothing else they could do but not consent, because people didn't always consent, but there was nothing else that was going to happen that their baby, other than their baby, be taken. I would like to, on behalf of the committee, acknowledge and sincerely thank the mothers, the fathers and the adoptees and family members who have contributed to this inquiry and who shared their accounts, and these are accounts, not stories, they're accounts. It was very clearly said during the inquiry, and their experience with us, as I said, sometimes for the first time. These accounts have had a profound effect on committee members and I'm sure all that heard them. It is undoubted that past policies and practices have caused great harm and hurt to mothers, fathers, adoptees and their family members. You can't help but come to any other conclusion when you are listening to the evidence. We have had hundreds and hundreds of submissions. We spoke to dozens and dozens of witnesses, not everybody because we just couldn't, and we've got thousands and thousands of pages of submissions and evidence, and we've had access to archives, to national archives and also archives from various government departments. The evidence shows, the evidence that we've shows tells the accounts of mothers and fathers who were pressured into giving up their babies by their families, by institutions, both state and territory and private institutions, by social workers, doctors, nurses, and those who they rightly expected to have helped them. Consents, evidence of consents not being properly taken, coercion, evidence of coercion occurred on people, and the fact that this pressure and these practices and policies have had lifelong impacts on mothers, on fathers, on adoptees and family members. To the adoptees, I'd like to say, we know that your mothers didn't abandon you. You weren't thrown away, because this is what we have received evidence about as well, is that the babies that are adopted who are now adults felt that they had been abandoned. And I know that the mothers have said to us they don't want their now adult children to feel that. I'd like to quote from the report. The committee received evidence from hundreds of women who gave birth in hospitals and other institutions between the late 1950s and 70s. Overwhelmingly, these women allege that laws were broken or that there was unethical behaviour on the part of staff in these institutions. The common failings include applying pressure to women to give consents, seeking consent earlier than permitted by the legislation, failing to give a consent signature or obtaining it by fraudulent means, the denial of reasonable requests, particularly for a mother to have access to her child. As explained in our report, certainly after new laws were enacted in the mid-1960s, actions of these types would in some cases have been illegal. Other experiences that reflected unethical practices include failure to provide information and failure to take a professional approach to a woman's care. It is time for governments and institutions involved to accept that such actions were wrong, not merely by today's standards, but by the values and laws of the time. Formal apologies must acknowledge this and not equivocate. The committee believes that governments and institutions need to take a more credible approach to former forced adoption practices. The committee does not express a view on any particular cases or about the prevalence of illegal or unethical actions, but apologies that deny them altogether lack credibility in the face of the weight of evidence. The committee agrees that official apologies should also identify the key wrongs, that vulnerable mothers were not given the care and respect that they needed during this difficult period of their lives, that mothers were poorly advised, that they were stigmatised by professionals and institutions, and that organisations and their staff in positions of authority stood in judgment of these women instead of respecting them. The committee recommends that the Commonwealth Government issue a formal statement of apology that identifies the actions and policies that resulted in forced adoption and acknowledges on behalf of the nation that harm suffered by many parents whose children were forcibly removed and by the children who were separated from their parents. The committee recommends that state and territory governments and non-government institutions that administered adoption should issue formal statements of apologies that acknowledge practices that were illegal or unethical, as well as other practices that contributed to the harm suffered by many parents whose children were forcibly removed and by the children who were separated from their parents. We have heard it said that what happened reflected the standards and the views of the time. We believe that is in fact not true. The committee concludes that the government and institutions in the 1960s and 70s were presented with a range of professional advice about adoption. Little of it challenged adoption as a practice. However, a great deal of it cautioned against placing pressures on mothers to encourage the surrender of babies for adoption, and some of it explicitly drew attention to the requirements of the law and the risks of it being violated. The evidence presented to us also shows that adoption should not have been treated as inevitable. We recommend that official apologies should include statements that take responsibility for the past policy choices made by institutions, leaders and staff, and not be qualified by reference to values or professional practice during the period in question. Mr Deputy President, I'm going to run out of time to address all of the 20 recommendations that are contained in this report. We also talk about the need for a national framework to address issues of reparation around the provision of professional support and counselling services, access to data, grievance procedures. I urge every member of this chamber and the community to read the report. I would like to specifically acknowledge, in the time I have here, the very hard work of my fellow committee members. This was a really, really hard inquiry. It was a very emotional inquiry. You couldn't help but take to heart the stories of the people, many of whom are in the gallery today. I would also very strongly like to thank the work of our secretariat, the committee secretariat, Mr Ian Holland, Dr Ian Holland, Dr Tim Kendall, Mr Mark McAnally and Miss Janice Webster and Mr Tim Hillman. These people went above and beyond the call of duty in order for us to get this report finished, particularly as our committee has a very heavy workload. We wanted as a committee to do justice to the accounts and experiences of the mothers, the fathers, the adoptees and the families who gave us so much evidence. For us, the evidence is overwhelming. The damage caused by these past policies and practices is overwhelming. It happened. We cannot deny it happened, and we need to apologise and put in place a framework that addresses it.
Thank you, Senator Siewert. Your time has expired. Senator Moore.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President.
Senator Moore.
Thank you.
Just before you commence, could I know that this is a very emotional issue. Could I just remind people in the gallery, whilst it was tolerated the first time and the second time, it would be nice if you could refrain from applauding. Understand that the emotional aspect is there, but we do need to maintain that decorum in the Senate. Thank you. I hope you understand. Senator Moore, thank you.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. To the people in the gallery, to the people who are listening to this, and to the people who've given us their lives, this is your report. Take it, read it and be proud, because none of this would have happened without each of you who have given us the incredible honour and also the responsibility of putting on paper and putting into the community knowledge your histories. 5 years ago in my office in Brisbane, 3 women came to see me. They brought some pictures, they brought a couple of books that they'd written, and they brought their pain and their anger and their disgust, because no one had believed what had happened to them. I was sitting listening to them at that time, and I personally couldn't believe that in my country, in places that I knew, people with whom I'd worked, the issues that they told me had happened. In some ways I was a bit fortunate because I live in Brisbane, and the first formal acknowledgement of the work that had happened, the horror that had occurred, was made by the Royal Brisbane Hospital, a hospital I knew well. And I think it's important that we acknowledge here that a number of people over really the last 5 years have begun to formally acknowledge the horrors that occurred in our community. That's not to say that people didn't know beforehand. No one can pretend that what we're putting into our report today was completely unknown in this country. It was known. It was either ignored or it was somehow explained away as the way that these women were treated was somehow for their good, that they were looking at, and I quote this with great interest, the best interests of the child. When I heard the women who actually gave evidence, and when I heard particularly the children of those women that gave evidence to our inquiry, I can accept that some people in the past thought that they were acting in the best interest of the child. I actually challenge those people now, wherever they are, whatever their values base were, whatever their explanations were, ask those children. Was it actually in the best interest of the child, who had no choice? Was it actually in the best interest of the mothers, who were in some cases, and I will actually qualify that by saying in some cases, given no choice? Was it actually in the best interest of the fathers, who many of them could not come to our inquiry because they did not know what had happened? So often we had found out through the process that fathers were dismissed in cases that their actual knowledge that they were actually going to be parents were kept from them. My particular horror was the fact that in many cases the mothers and the fathers were separated, but in many cases they were actually threatened with the law of the day, so that if the mother gave the name of the father and they were underage, their whole freedom, their legal record and their chance to have any future were all threatened, and the risk of that was that they would know that they were going to have a child. What we've been able to do in this place is important, but it's only the first step. Sometimes when we're in the wonderful job that we have in this Senate, we can be part of something that has a real potential to change lives and to change our community. I think today is one of those days that we can share in this Senate with the people for whom it is most important, an opportunity that we can take a step forward. We have 20 recommendations. They'll go through the process and they'll go to governments. However, the key aspect of this is that the history of what happened in our country, what happened to women, what happened to men, and what happened to the children who are now adults, but I say at this stage to the children over a long period of time, will now be known and acknowledged. One of the most poignant moments of our whole inquiry was when a woman stood before us and said, "I just want to make sure that my child knows that I loved him. I want to make sure that she had found out through the system that her child had been born and was a boy, that he knows that I didn't give him away." Every family deserves to know their own history. And so I just want to take a short time to talk about one of the aspects. Different senators will talk about different things and this discussion will go on. But I just want to talk about the aspects that came up about knowing who you are and knowing that you have a birth certificate that indicates who you are. And one of our key recommendations in this inquiry is that there will be that ability that people will be able to seek and have true documents of identification. That does, and I almost gave a little clap there as well. But in terms of process, it's one of those issues that I am not negating the role of adopted parents. I am not negating the role of adopted families. However, every person in this country has the right to know exactly who their birth parents are. And that needs to be a genuine proof of identity for all purposes in our country. And one of our key recommendations in 2012 is that that documentation should be available anywhere you live in this country and should be there, that you know who your mother was and who your father was, if that is available to be known. But people know when those birth certificates were originally issued, there is no way you can separate a mother from a child. When a woman gives birth anywhere in this country, at any time, you can have no mistake about who's given birth to a child. So in terms of the registry process and across the different areas, I think that's something that we can achieve, certainly in 2012. I know that people will read this report. You know, sometimes you write reports in this place and you know it's going to go onto a shelf and someone will actually look at it in the future and it will be on some kind of record. I have no fear that people will be reading this report because of all of you, because you will make sure that people read the report. What we need to do together, though, is actually move forward with the number of recommendations we have. Senator Siewert has pointed out that clearly we need to ensure that there is a national apology to every one of you, to the mothers, to the fathers, to the children, to anyone who was adopted, to the people who are caught up in this horror of our history. We now can say that it is a horror of our history and not pretend that it didn't happen. We've also said that that kind of knowledge should be entrenched in some way so that people outside the immediate community will know what happened. And I think that's where we're going to rely on everybody to see how we can actually do that the best way. There will be things that need to happen for the people who've been caught up in this place in terms of professional support, trained professional support for all of those who have been damaged by the process. There needs to be an acknowledgement in our history that this happened. There needs to be consideration for what the people who have been hurt need to have in their own lives. And we need to be able to ensure that people can find one another in every way if we can help. That's part of the process, but I want to put on record as well my acknowledgement of the Secretariat. I think we have a document here that for perhaps the first time looks at what happened as the rules were changed in our country about adoption and adoptive processes. But I want to say to all of you that this has changed so much in my own life. I want to say to all of you, I am sorry. I am sorry for your hurt. I'm sorry for your pain. I have been made stronger by hearing about the lives you've led, and I want to work with each of you into the future to make sure that we ensure that we can have effective processes for people who have been so damaged and so hurt for so long.
Thank you, Senator Moore. Senator Boyce.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. As you will notice, Mr Deputy President, this report is a unanimous report from the Labor Party, the Greens and from the Coalition. It was something that we worked very hard to achieve because this is such an important issue that it was not an issue that where there should be any dissent around how it happened. I'd like to add my thanks to those that Senator Siewert and Senator Moore have made. Firstly, to the people who've travelled to be here today, to all the submitters, to the many, many dozens of people who appeared as witnesses, and particularly to the Secretariat, who really did go above and beyond. When you're getting emails that are timed at 1:45 a.m. about trying to get drafts exactly right so that we could be here to release this report today, you know that they're caring just as much as we are. There are, as we've said, 20 recommendations in this report, and 7 of those 20 specifically deal with apologies. They not only set out who should make formal apologies, the Commonwealth, the states, the territories, organisations and hospitals and institutions that were involved in the forced adoption industry, but they also set out how to make apologies. And we thought this was very important because amongst, it's perhaps not uncommon now for general apologies to be made to people who have been harmed by behaviours of the past. But there are apologies and there are apologies. And it's very important to acknowledge that whether you think people were doing what they thought was the right thing at the time, that you know it wasn't the right thing. To acknowledge that people need reparation, they need redress to get on and to move on from the issues. This inquiry took us 18 months. We started in November 2010. We were intending to report much earlier than this, but the sheer volume of information and the type of information and the need to, in most cases, we had 9 hearings. We went to every capital city. In most cases, we had a community forum as part of our inquiry system, and this was so important to give as many people as possible the chance to tell their story. As Senator Siewert said, there are a lot of people who hadn't told their story until this inquiry was held, and many found that very helpful to be able to give their account of what had happened to them. Before we started this inquiry, I knew of 5 people, 3 of them within my extended family, who had been affected by what I now call forced adoptions. It wasn't a term I'd even thought about, and thank you for giving me that opportunity. Since we've started this inquiry, it's not just the hundreds of submitters, but people that you meet in everyday life who tell you this happened to you. I was even talking to an advisor to a senior politician yesterday, and she said, my mother was one of those people. She has an older sibling that she hasn't yet, they can't find. And perhaps my first experience of the problems of forced adoption was a woman who worked for me many years ago. She was looking for her, this is just on the cusp of internet, she was looking for her son who she knew had been adopted to the UK. She was 17 when she became pregnant with him. She put that child up for adoption because her parents told her to, but she went on to marry the father and have 2 more children with that man, so that she was looking for the full brother or sister of her existing children, and it was something that got to her every day. But she said, I was 17 and my mother said to me, come home without that thing or don't come home at all. I didn't know what to do. So she came home without the thing. And I'm indicating that I'm putting that in quotes. Luckily, she had repaired her relationship with her mother, but she hadn't at that time found her son. In some ways, that is a mild form of the stories that we heard around forced adoption. There were so many more violent stories about people being literally held down, people being drugged, smacked across the face in front of policemen, as Senator Moore said, threatened with their partner being jailed for carnal knowledge if they were to reveal his name, even though the two of them were teenagers together. But even amongst all this, we can't claim that we didn't know what was going on, and there was quite a lot of evidence that we received around what was known at the time about what was the right way to go about it. And I'd just like to quote briefly from Mari Coleman, who I think is probably well known to many people here as a great advocate for women. She said, we had a situation where women who became pregnant outside of a marital relationship fundamentally had three options. One was a shotgun wedding, one was an illegal abortion, and one was adoption. There were no benefits or supports to enable women to keep their children with them. When one looks at some of the other literature, the state of orphanages and children's homes through the 1940s, 50s and 1960s was pretty shocking. She's dead right, it was pretty shocking. As we've said before, this inquiry is about forced adoptions, and for some reason that we attempt to tease out some of the reasons why adoption became flavour of the decade, I guess, and adoptions in Australia peaked in 1971-72. There were 9,798 adoptions in 1971-72. Last year, there were 412. That gives you an idea of how we got very excited about adoption and how we have learned some of the lessons about the problems with adoption. Forced adoption is defined as meaning adoption where a child's natural parent or parents were compelled to relinquish a child for adoption. So we are not talking about situations where an adoption may have been willingly entered into, knowledgeably and informed way entered into by people who did genuinely consent to having their child adopted, whether they were married or not married. But we are talking about where people were forced into the situation. And we talk also about the area of knowledge that was held at the time and the type of accounts that we have. The Royal Women's Hospital, for instance, has been criticised at some length in our report, and we do not do this because we think it was a particularly bad example, but simply because we have quite a lot of evidence from people who were affected by what happened at the Royal Women's Hospital. Perhaps I should clarify, it is an awful example, but it is no worse than many, many others, and perhaps better than some. We had a lot of evidence. Royal Women's Hospital, in fact, had 5,000 adoptions between 1940 and 1987. So we have significant evidence from some of the people there. And yet they could say in a report that they found no evidence of illegal practices at the RWH and no evidence of hospital-wide policies that discriminated specifically against single mothers. Well, we go on to outline 9 witness accounts, and there were many more that we could have used. 9 witness accounts which would suggest that there had been policy-wide practices and that there was knowledge at the time about the brutality of what was happening. And we believe also one nurse who worked in the Royal Women's Hospital in the 1960s and 70s who has apologised herself, said, Yes, we had taken babies from their mothers at birth without them holding or even seeing their baby. Their mothers were then admitted to wards without their babies and ostracised in many different ways, finally being discharged about a week later. I felt very sorry for what I had done, even though at the time I believed what we were doing was right, in quotes, for the child and mother. However, I now believe that the process was very cruel, unjust and very dehumanising to mother and child. These are eyewitness accounts that the Royal Women's Hospital could use to perhaps re-examine the idea that they could find no evidence that forced adoption practices occurred in their hospital in the 50s, 60s and 70s. And I hope that what our report does is add to what should already exist, the legitimacy that these eyewitness accounts have of the treatment that went on, not just of the women, but of their children and of the fathers of those children. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Boyce. Senator Carol Brown.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. I'd like to also rise today to speak on this very important inquiry. The inquiry by the Senate Community Affairs References Committee into the Commonwealth contribution to former forced adoption policies and practices. This inquiry has been a very emotional and traumatic journey and has involved a large number of personal stories which would have been very difficult to share. I'd like to place on record my thanks and appreciation to all those people who have recounted their painful stories. Many of these stories have not been told before. You have all made a personal sacrifice, but it is a sacrifice that means your experiences can no longer be ignored. I'd also like to acknowledge that very understandably some people, some women, have given evidence to distressing and have yet to tell their story. Since the beginning of the inquiry in November 2010, the committee has received hundreds of individual submissions and submissions from organisations, including boxes and boxes of archival material. Also obtained was a range of additional information, correspondence, answers to questions or notice with witnesses. A range of records were also used. The committee held 10 public hearings and visited every capital city except for Darwin. I will talk particularly about the hearing in my own home state of Tasmania a little later on. I would like to give my sincere thanks to the committee secretariat for their support and research into this important inquiry. Their hard work is evident, I believe, in the quality of the final report. The term forced adoption is as cruel as it sounds. For a period of time between the late 40s up until now, in some cases the late 80s, single mothers were made to give up their babies. This fact is indisputable. They were forced to do this through a range of different means, including being coerced, being drugged, being tricked into signing adoption papers, or being physically shackled to beds. I think I can speak for all members of the committee when I say that the pain these young women must have experienced and still continue to experience is unimaginable for those of us who have not been through it. As evidenced by the stories told in the report, these women were also treated appallingly throughout their pregnancies by the very institutions that were meant to be caring for them. There are allegations of unethical and or even unlawful practice. In some cases, doctors, nurses, social workers, midwives showed no respect to these frightened and often very young women. There are also descriptions of poor medical treatment being provided to these mothers during the birth, with medical staff taunting them about their unwed status and not providing proper pain relief or proper treatment. Some of the behaviour towards these mothers can only be described as unethical. One of the mothers who made a submission recalled, "I was treated inhumanely. A nurse even told me the pain I was experiencing was punishment for getting pregnant before marriage. I was ignored and left alone with the contractions until the birthing began. I had no idea what to expect. They shouted at me and pushed a gas mask onto my face. They made comments about me but didn't talk to me at all." To add to the pressure being exerted to adopt their child out, vital information was also withheld. Single pregnant women were not told of the social security benefits available to them were they to keep their baby, but pushed towards adoption as their only legitimate choice. Added to this, many families sent women away to unfamiliar surroundings with no family or friends for support. Once babies were born, the clean break theory on many occasions was implemented. The clear break theory meant that mothers were often denied the right to hold or even to see their child before it was taken away. They were given drugs to dry up their milk, their breasts were bandaged up, and they were not told the gender of their child. When they asked to see their babies, they were told it was in the best interest of their children that they were sent somewhere else, and they were selfish to not want the best for their child. At the hearing in Hobart, I heard one of the mothers describe her experience in the hospital in an eloquent and powerful way. She said, "They created an unbalance of power. The power of hospital staff was lined up alongside that of married prospective adoptive parents who wanted a baby, my baby. Staff allegiance was to them, not to me. They did not hear or see me. I was nothing and no one. I was in a place where I was supposed to be cared for, hospital, but I was ignored. I was guilty of nothing, yet I was made to feel ashamed, guilty, inferior and bad." The Salvation Army representative at the hearing in Hobart also supported these descriptions. He spoke of recalling of the great distress of mothers in hospitals at not being able to see their babies, and of mothers not recalling signing consent forms and not being able to revoke the consent even within the legal consent period. Many, I have to say, never knew that revoking consent was even an option. We have heard many more stories, and many similar stories were told. We heard that the ripple effect from these forced adoptions is huge and includes mothers and their children, and some of the nurses and social workers who look back on the practice with anxiety. We hear firsthand from mothers how the ongoing trauma of having their baby forcibly removed is still impacting on their lives. They also spoke of the successful and unsuccessful attempts to reunite with their children who were taken away, and the anger that many of the children who were adopted still felt. The former chair of the Joint Select Committee of the Tasmanian Parliament that looked into adoption between the years of 1950 to 1988 told the story of a 17-year-old woman who had a loving, supportive boyfriend and a grandmother who she lived with and was going to help look after the baby so the girl could resume her work and study. Despite having all this, the baby was forcibly adopted because she was unwed. In light of these practices that I've outlined and the many submissions made to the inquiry, the report handed down today outlines some very clear recommendations. Perhaps the strongest of these recommendations is the call for the Commonwealth to issue a formal statement of apology that identifies the actions and policies that resulted in forced adoptions and that acknowledges the harm suffered by many parents and children who suffered from forced adoptions. This is because despite adoption coming under individual state and territory jurisdiction, the Commonwealth is the only body that can legitimately encompass the states and territories in an apology, and the report finds it cannot completely absolve itself of responsibility. Related recommendations advise that a policy should include statements to take responsibility for the past policy choices made by institutions, leaders and staff, and not be qualified by references to values or professional practice during the period in question. The report also states that this apology should be presented in a wide range of forms and be widely published. There is acknowledgement of the other apologies that have already been made, such as the apology from the Western Australian State Government and a handful of other institutions, and the recommendations that other state and territory governments and non-government institutions that administered adoptions should issue formal statements of apology. The development of a national framework through the Community and Disability Services Ministers' Conference to address the consequences of forced adoption is also recommended. Other recommendations are about ensuring greater access to records, making these searches easier, and that any institutions that hold records have the undertaking to identify all records and make the information available. The report also recommends that the Commonwealth commission an exhibition so the experience of those affected by forced adoption practice are documented and not forgotten. Finally, I would like to note that there is a recommendation that the Commonwealth establish as a matter of urgency affordable and regionally available specialised professional support and counselling services to address the specific needs of those affected by forced adoption, as well as the establishment of Commonwealth-funded peer support groups. Due to the lack of records, we cannot accurately say the number of forced adoptions that occurred in Australia, but we can estimate that figure is in many thousands. It is made very clear in the report that the practice of forced adoption was wrong, not just by today's values, but by the values and standards of the time. This report cannot change what happened, but it can go a small way towards recognising and righting the wrongs of the past. I'd like to extend my gratitude to all those who shared their accounts with us. It is only through hearing your stories that we can properly understand and acknowledge the practice of forced adoption. It will enable all Australians to know your stories, to understand the wrongs that were carried out on young mothers, young fathers and their children, that these practices, these unethical practices, shattered lives and did happen. I would like to commend the report to the Senate, and I think a fitting way for me to conclude is by using a poignant words of one of the mothers that gave evidence to the inquiry. And she said, "Last but not least, I want people to know that I love my baby, that she was wanted, and that I am her mother."
Thank you, Senator Carol Brown. Senator McKenzie.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. Between the 1930s and the 1970s, there were about 10,000 babies adopted in Australia each year. In 1971, there were 9,798 adoptions. 20 years later, by 1991, this had declined to a little over 1,000, and in 2006, a little over 500, and today about 3 every 100 live births. Something just doesn't add up. The Senate Community Affairs Reference Committee into this Commonwealth's contribution to former forced adoption policies and practice is a massive report. The issues have been complex and we've worked with a large volume of evidence, and it has been a privilege. The committee heard 418 submissions, many from individuals and others from organisations. The accounts received by the committee dated from the 1950s to as recently as 1987. And the reports were very detailed, including a large number of accounts that clearly outlined that babies were taken for adoption against their mother's will. Many women told us they were pressured, deceived or threatened in order to secure signatures on adoption consent forms, actions that were likely in breach of the policies and laws of the time. For many mothers, their experiences were harrowing. The accounts are very personal and traumatic for the mothers and the children involved. According to the Royal Women's Hospital, up to 45% of Victorian unmarried mothers relinquished their babies for adoption between 1945 and 1975, a period often referred to as the heyday of adoption, and many of these were forced. The dilemma facing the single mother was exacerbated by community attitudes and social values that embraced adoption as the solution to illegitimacy and infertility, and failed to provide viable alternatives. As a result of the strong community interest and the media coverage in this story and the number of submissions, we have taken 18 months to get to today. I particularly thank committee members who've worked extremely hard, and some of them can't be with us today, and I think particularly of Judith Adams and Senator Coonan, who both contributed to the production of this report. We also considered the archival material from the 50s to the 70s and worked to shed more light on the Commonwealth's role in past adoption practices. We investigated the roles of the states and territories and the adoption information laws. Nobody has the right to take a child from its mother. What happened in hospitals throughout Australia was wrong. Most of the 400 or more submissions heard by the committee were harrowing tales of regret, abuse, neglect and loss. You may be thinking out there, not all children adopted had a harrowing experience, and you're right. Given the thousands of babies adopted, the committee was not looking for and did not get submissions from happy families. We had a clear reference to be looking and talking about and exposing forced adoptions. Still, the practice was and remains misguided. There were thousands of babies taken from their mothers, and while there were probably many that have very ordinary childhoods, when you take a child by force or coercion, you change a life journey. In many cases, you take a part of the mother's soul and you take the child's heritage. There is loss. I'd like to briefly tell you two stories of women who had their child taken without consent. Both women were from regional towns in New South Wales, just over the border from Victoria, where I'm from. About 45 years ago, Joan discovered she was expecting a baby. She hadn't realised how babies were made, and when she told her boyfriend, he ended the relationship, and this wasn't unusual. In fear and trepidation, she gave her parents the news and asked if, with their help, she might keep the baby. They quickly organised a hospital appointment in Melbourne, another state, and she was very clearly told that that just wouldn't be possible. And by the time the baby was born, Joan had a new boyfriend who was courageously prepared to accept the baby as his own. Sadly, the grandparents and the hospital refused to allow it. The baby arrived, the boyfriend held her for a few minutes, and the mother was given the forms to sign before the little girl was taken away. The couple were married and had 2 children of their own. No one knew, including the couple's children. 30 years later, the child sent her mother a letter. She'd been part of a loving family, but her adopted parents had died, and she was ready to learn about her own family history. After searching in Victoria for nearly 10 years, she thought to search the New South Wales registry, and with luck, the 2 names were connected. Sadly, Joan was very ill with cancer, and just 6 months later, it was with amazement and surprise, and I can tell you there was some shocked whisperings in the Catholic Church that day when 3 children, rather than 2, gave the eulogy. In this case, the little girl could easily have been raised by her mother. Before she died, Joan explained that the hospital forced her to sign the adoption documents, that the social workers were of the belief that the obstacles facing the single mothers were insurmountable, and she couldn't be sure the young man would marry her. Now that she had delivered a baby, that adoption was the best possible solution, and it would allow her to get on with her life and pretend it didn't happen. This position was further supported by the nurses and unanimously upheld by her parents. Joan felt enormous pressure to do the right thing. Explaining this to her daughter so many years later, and with only moments and months to live, she felt enormous regret. The loss had been so great that she hadn't known how to explain it to her other children who were now adults. That daughter has been closely following this committee's inquiry. She might even be here today. I know that she feels an enormous sense of loss for the life she might have led. She wanted more time with her natural mother. She expected the adoption system would keep the details of her birth and make them accessible for when she needed them. She felt let down that the details about her arrival were so difficult to find, and she is devastated that the system didn't support her request to find her mother sooner than it did. And she still doesn't know anything about her natural father. There is nothing on the record. She does, however, have a brother and a sister and a second chance to get to know the man that held her during those first few minutes of her life. The second mother had a relationship with a pilot towards the end of the Second World War. She was more determined than the first. She and the baby's grandmother travelled to Victoria to visit an ageing aunt, where they stayed for 6 months. When the baby was born, the mother flatly refused to sign the adoption documents. With much coercion, she finally agreed to sign a form that allowed the baby girl to be fostered, with an option of collecting it later. The little girl was given to a foster family in Melbourne. They indulged her with love and kindness, opportunities and education, until the natural grandmother decided it was time the child could return to her mother. Sadly, the child was 6. At 65, she often talks about the trauma and the confusion and the loss of losing her foster family, being handed to the nuns in black on the train at Southern Cross Station on a Sunday afternoon, and she was taken to a small country town and given to a mother who was humiliated and a grandfather who wouldn't own her. She would argue that if she'd stayed where she was. I expect my stories are similar to many thousands of stories where the outcome wasn't as harrowing or as despicable as the tales we heard in this committee inquiry, and so many are actually contained within the report itself. Even so, each and every one of these Australians need our sincere apologies and our acknowledgement. We need to acknowledge that whatever the intentions and beliefs of the time, past adoption practice caused lasting consequences for many relinquishing mothers and sometimes also for their children and their extended families. That irrespective of the mores of the time, this committee does not accept that it was legal or ethical to take a child from its mother for the purpose of adoption. Today we recognise that this action was both illegal and unethical. I understand that many relinquishing mothers experienced and continue to experience feelings of grief, pain, anger, helplessness and loss, and for this I apologise unreservedly. I'd like to thank you to all the women and their children and to the professionals involved for telling us your story. I'd actually like to thank the Community Affairs Committee as its newest member for its track record in bringing to light the issues of our nation and putting them on the table and exposing the things that we just need to take a good hard look about if we want to be serious about being true to ourselves as a forward-looking nation. It's actually a testament to the women involved on the committee. So thank you, and I also commend the report to the Senate.
Senator Stevens.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. As someone who wasn't a member of the committee and wasn't able to participate in this inquiry, I would actually like to congratulate all of the committee and everyone who participated, because this is an incredibly disturbing Senate inquiry and an incredibly powerful report. Madam Acting Deputy President, only recently I became aware of an expression called the baby scoop era, which is used to describe what's happened to these people. It's an awful expression, isn't it? It's quite visually challenging, the notion of wrenching a child from its mother's arms, I guess. But it's what happened, not just here in Australia, but also in Canada, in the US and the UK, and it was very much the method of the times. So I've read many of the stories documented, I've read many of the submissions, and they are quite traumatising for everyone, I'm sure. But I've known others' stories personally to me, and I remember very vividly when I was growing up, a young woman being sent to Brisbane. She left town as a wild-eyed, bright young thing and came back 6 months later distressed, depressed, and eventually attempted to take her own life. And at the same time, girls from an orphanage came to my school. And I remember a discussion when one of the girls didn't come back to school in fifth form. And you know, there were lots of stories about what had happened to her, told with great fear and trepidation by her friends. And we were just gobsmacked that something like this could be happening. And then not long ago at a school reunion, the issue was raised again with me, as 3 former classmates, which was really quite a shock to me, revealed something to me of the experiences within their families of forced adoption. So as we've heard from the other speakers, the inquiry has received horrible testimony, dreadful evidence. The callousness, I think, is gut-wrenching. That's really what comes through. The personal accounts that we saw in the practices revealed on Four Corners program this week really do attest to the courage of the people, the women who are able to tell their story. And they did that on behalf of those who couldn't. So I certainly do congratulate them for their courage and their grace. In 2002, in fact, there was a New South Wales parliamentary inquiry into adoption practices where many similar stories were told and threats were made, promises given, and the sense of powerlessness and the ensuing heartache. And Dr. Meryl Moore, in her 2005 PhD thesis on the subject, which she gave the title the silent violence Australia's white stolen children, she quoted in that Jigsaw, that fantastic organisation from Brisbane, and this was right at the beginning of her thesis. She said, "In relation to adoption, the question needs to be asked, in what other period of human history did young mothers willingly defy nature and give away their babies en masse to strangers?" Well, it was an unspeakable act of cruelty, I think. And when we speak of forced adoption, we're talking about something that's culturally imposed. And that's very different, as we heard from Senator Boyce. That's very different from someone who chooses to makes a tough decision to have a child adopted. So it's great. It is really very powerful. The work of the Community Affairs Committee is exemplary and so potent and powerful. And since 2007, we have seen acts of injustice recognised. The apology to the stolen generations, I think, was a potent moment in the healing of the Australian psyche. And then the apology to the forgotten Australians, children raised in institutional care. That too helped to ease the pain and hurt of lost childhoods and identity. So today, through this report, I know, I don't just hope, I know, that we're giving hope to the thousands of young women, and in many cases their parents and their families and their partners and their children who are forced to relinquish their babies, that there can be some redress, some formal acknowledgement of their hurt and pain, some sense that governments and churches and communities and institutions were all wrong. We all know that many of those involved in removing Aboriginal children from their homes did so in the belief that it was for the greater good. And no doubt the same applies to those who thought adoption into a two-parent family was automatically a better and more desirable outcome to life with an unmarried mother. But the fact that a practice was followed in good faith doesn't necessarily make it right, and that's really what we've heard today. This is the evidence, the culmination. And the Four Corners program, again, showed just how much this weighed on the minds of social workers, hospital staff, and I'm sure many adoptive parents. I don't know, you may not remember, but in 1942, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, as I remember it from my school days, one of the first things he did when he got to America was to basically kidnap a Native American child. And he later adopted him and had him baptised and called him Diego, in order, he said, to save his immortal soul. And it might have suited Christopher Columbus very well to have a local translator whom he could control. But I'm also prepared to believe that he genuinely thought young Diego would be better off with him than with his own family. However, the sincerity of his beliefs certainly doesn't justify the actions. And the forced removal of babies in Australia may have been seen by many as an act of kindness, intended to save those children from harmful environments. But just as in the case of Christopher Columbus, we know that's simply not good enough, because what we've seen in this Senate report is nothing really less than a catalogue of human rights violations, and that's the truth. Violations of the rights of the mothers, such as that wonderful outspoken Christine Cole, whose experience as a 16-year-old inspired her to research the issue and to write her doctoral thesis. And it's difficult to convey how people living in society that values and enforces an individual's civil and human rights, what life was actually like 40 or 60 years ago for vulnerable young women who lacked knowledge and support and resources, and frankly even for those who did. Girls weren't instructed about pregnancy and labour and delivery. Pregnant girls were hidden away or sent away to the eternal shame of their families. They were isolated and not provided information, as we've heard already this afternoon. In short, they weren't actually recognised as legitimate mothers, and when they were babies were forcibly removed, nor were they recognised as legitimate mourners. The work of psychologists such as John Bowlby and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross has taught us a lot about love and loss and grief, and the pages of this report bring those psychological theories vividly to life. It's not only the mothers whose human rights were violated, so were the rights of countless children who were denied access to their natural heritage. was truly ill-conceived to describe not the babies but the practice of forced adoption. Ill-conceived because of the absence of integrity and respect. These values are fundamental to how a society should work. And integrity in being forthright and accurate and honest with all its partners involved in decisions, and respect in recognising each person's right to autonomous decision-making, or what some people call the ethic of self-determination. Adoption is a lifelong process, not a once-time event. So when engaging in such a process, the innate dignity of human beings, and of course this includes the children, must be considered. Columbus might not have realised this, but we do. The report makes it abundantly clear that human dignity was not a consideration in the case of these young women and their babies. The dominant themes are raw emotions, betrayal, humiliation, condemnation, abandonment, trickery, grief, and of course abject loss. The report brings great heartbreak into the light from the shadows of the past, the not too distant past. And although, as Senator Siewert has said, it makes harrowing reading, it's always a good thing when the truth is revealed. Even when the truth is what psychiatrist Jeff Rickaby has rightly described as a stain on our history. Nothing can heal the experience of love and loss of these women, who carry it with them every day. But I hope sincerely that the report and the recommendations, we can help remove their sense of shame and restore their dignity and self-worth. My favourite poet, as you know, Madam Acting Deputy President, is Leonard Cohen, and he would surely say of this report, nothing is perfect. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. I hope the light shines brightly.
Senator Pratt, and Senator Pratt, I just need to remind you and also to the people in the gallery, we have a limited time to actually talk about this report. Senator Pratt's probably only got a couple of minutes, but I want you to know that at the end of it, she will move a motion to make sure it stays on our notice paper, which means that tomorrow and the next time we come back for sittings, other senators can stand up and add their contribution to this report in the days ahead, even though we're going to finish it in just a couple of minutes. Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. I rise this evening and I haven't prepared extensive remarks, but I wanted to pay tribute to all of the people that have given evidence to this inquiry and to thank the committee for its work. It's not an inquiry that I have been able to participate in. But it is an issue that I have followed closely over many years, having reviewed the Western Australian Adoption Act in the early 2000s. One of the issues that came to light then, which still causes me distress, is the continuing existence of contact vetoes that are legally enforceable and have criminal offences attached to them. The idea that in this day and age we could be criminalising, continue to criminalise the desire to contact your kin, to me seems quite extraordinary. I would like to acknowledge all the brave people who have given evidence to this inquiry, and I'm sorry you even had to ask for an apology, because I think the evidence speaks for itself. I certainly apologise. I am truly sorry for your experiences. I'd like to pay tribute to brave women like Margaret MacDonald, who came to my office to talk to me in Western Australia about her experiences and about the need for the Western Australian government to apologise. And I'm very proud of my home state for having moved that apology and having led the nation in that regard, and it is time for the federal parliament to follow suit. People deserve to know about their origins, and we need to be very careful that we do not repeat the mistakes of the past. And frankly, we are still in danger of repeating many of those mistakes. Adoption acts are certainly much tighter today, and we do realise what an extraordinary thing it is to separate someone from their kin.
Senator Pratt, I just need to remind you the clock.
Oh, sorry, I didn't. Okay.
Well, if that being the case, I should probably simply move to continue my remarks. But just as I do that, I know that there will be a great deal of visibility towards this report today. I had many friends who were adopted, and I know many of them will not yet have reconciled their origins. And I would like the visibility of this report be a cause to all of those people to think about perhaps making contact and using this as that opportunity.
All right, so So thank you on behalf of the Senate to the people who came into the chamber this afternoon. Senator Pratt is seeking leave to continue her remarks. And what that simply means is when I put that motion, that simply means that that report will stay on this piece of paper that we call the notice paper, so other senators can talk to this report in the days and weeks ahead. So it stays there as a reminder for us to pick it up, and other people might want to provide a contribution. So Senator Pratt is seeking leave to continue her remarks. Is leave granted?
Thank you.
Leave is granted. Thank you very much.